All right, welcome to From Any to This, using concrete error types instead of a catch-all, the catch-all being anyhow, and concrete error types being defined with this error. However, there's a twist to this actually, with more macros. So this will be a talk with defining some new macros, explaining why that's necessary, and how we solved some of the big challenges we had. So first off, I'm Leo. I'm an engineer at Deno. I integrated various web APIs, including WebGPU. I also am one of the maintainers, partially, of WGPU and a few other projects. So what was the problem? Well, some background first. Deno is a big project. We have a lot of crates and packages. So for reference, the indented part is crates. Top level is repos, and that totals to about roughly 50 packages and 14 to 15 repos. And that's a lot of code because checking as of yesterday morning, we have about 15.5 million lines of Rust. And for the ones interested, also 6.5 million lines of JavaScript and TypeScript. And that is a decent amount of stuff. And all of this has error handling. Or, well, should have, at least proper one. So yeah, the problem is Deno's a big project, and we have all these errors defined all over the place using anyhow. But anyhow is not great for libraries, and we were using it for all these libraries. Like only the top-level Deno one is the binary. Everything else is just packages and libraries that are being used by other companies and projects. So using anyhow for this was less than ideal, but it was just a historical reason, aka we were too lazy to do proper error handling, I guess. But yeah, so we needed to improve this, and for me the last straw was when we encountered this, or rather I had to write this line of code, which is stringifying the error and checking if it starts with a specific string, which is like, what the hell are we doing? And the problem is we couldn't downcast it either because we did not know what the original error was, because it was wrapped in another error that was then also in a anyhow that was wrapped by another error and then anyhow again. So basically we had no clue where the source was, and even if we knew where it was, downcasting to it would have been a nightmare. So I was like, okay, we have a big problem on hand. We cannot do this. This is awful. I mean, we have all this infrastructure. This error exists. Why are we not using it? And apparently we were using it for like 1 or 2 errors. Yeah, not very helpful. So I took it upon myself, spending about half a year rewriting everything from anyhow to using this error, including binary code, like not just libraries. In my opinion, binary should also be using this error, which goes against what many people think and believe. So yeah, the biggest problem with doing this is that Deno is a complex project that interacts with V8, which is the JavaScript engine that is also used by like Chrome, for example. And we have a layer to transition Rust functions into JavaScript functions, so being able to call Rust from the JavaScript side of things. But these functions need to return errors as well, and everything was integrated and built in such a way that it works on anyhow and not actual errors. So basically, the definition of one of those functions is as such, which is we use the op2 macro, which just spits out so much garbage, I have to say, but that's another topic. It roughly generates like 400 lines of code just for that simple call, for example. And yeah, the string attribute is just the return type, and the return type can actually define as a result or an option if necessary. But in our case, this is about errors. So yeah, we need to change the entire infrastructure behind the scenes on handling actual errors defined in a specific way. Because beforehand, we were doing this. So we had this file that was generating the error class in JavaScript based on just a match, and we had this defined many times, and not on just in this file. We had like a bunch of files over the place. But the problem then is, then we have this downcast hell, like just doing or else, downcast. Let's see here, yeah, this one. This is truly awful, and this is not how it should be. But the problem is, especially with this approach, was that all packages that used ours, like all projects that were using our crates, had to implement this entire block themselves. So all the maintainers of various projects using the Deno libraries, they were stuck with having something like this, having to define the errors themselves, which is completely terrible, and people were just copy and pasting what we had in our repo. And yeah, so we basically had to change how this works, because we have this getError class name, which was just a hook you could define in one of our construction functions. And whoops, that shouldn't be popping up. Come on. Okay, good. So yeah, we need to have basically change our entire chain of error handling all over the place. So in the end, how do we come to a solution here? Well, oh, for fuck's sake. Can you? I could, but anyhow, okay, so the solution. Redo everything and create yet another macro crate to add even more macros to the mix. And the reason for a new macro is we need to somehow define the definition of errors in JavaScript instead of having all these weird match statements we have up here. So yeah, let's create a new crate that is called Deno_error. Very creative name. Yeah, so it basically, it works together with this error. So you're supposed to use it as a combination of adding this error, and the abilities that it gives is just defining a few traits and some structs, and gives us 3 macro attributes. So let's take a quick look at the structure of the traits. Well, a single trait, which is the JSError class, which is very confusing for our code base because we have a lot of things called JSError. We have like 3 different structs, and people are mad about it. So we've been trying to rename a few things, but it's descriptive. So yeah, the JSError class has a few different functions on it, or rather trait, not class. The get class, which defines the string name in JavaScript for the class that is being defined. We have getMessage, which defines the message of the error. And getRef is just a generic utility we have to do some downcasting in the 2 scenarios we have where we still need to do some sort of downcasting. And then we have additional properties. This is a thing we could not do beforehand, which was a big blocker for us, and is being able to define additional properties on a JavaScript error from the Rust side. For example, we have an IO error. We want to display the error code for that. And for IO error, we did manage to do it beforehand by just hard coding a specific logic just for IO error, but we needed for like various different errors to also do this. And this had to be implemented in the lowest denominator of our packages, which was not something we want to do. So being able to define additional properties by using our macro and trait was a requirement. And yeah, the additional properties is just an iterator that gives the name and the value. And a property value can just be a string or a number. We have considered adding more, but this seems to cover for enough cases. And if people want more, we can always add more. But yeah, so then we also have this JSError box, which basically is just a boxed version and lets us create individual instances without having to create an entire class, because sometimes we just want to do a one-off instead of having to create an entire error, which is just for convenience on our side. But that kind of goes being into anyhow again, but not quite. It's acceptable, I would say. Yeah, so basically just wraps around JSError class box and has a way to define a standalone version. And yeah, so here's an example of usage of our Deno error, JS error macro. So yeah, this goes very well combined with this error. So we define a class, which is set to, for example, inherit in this case, which inherits the class from the error that is defined on. So in this case, your parse error, for which we have implemented a default implementation in the Deno error crate. And then the class, or the error message is, in this case, transparent, but we can also see further down that there is the DOM exception network error, for example, that is defined as a string, and then the error is defined in line with this error. So basically, it just gives you the full side of being able to define both a class and the error message in one fell swoop. And the macro does a bunch of extra things as well. For example, so the three attributes we have actually are class. So being able to define the class. So we have some preset keywords like all the built-in native JavaScript error names, which are, in this case, generic, just means the normal error. Then we have type for type error. We have URI for URI error, syntax for syntax error, and there's two more also. And these are just shorthands we wanted to have in place to make this faster instead of having strings defined everywhere, which a typo here and then everything breaks. So we want to just have one central place, but you can still define your own class yourself using just a string if it's not one of the built-in ones. Yeah, then we have the property attribute. So basically, it lets us define additional fields on JavaScript error using an attribute. So in the first case, you can define the name. For example, if you have a tuple enum variant, which is just property equals the name that you want to define it, or if you use it in a normal struct, you can just, or an enum struct variant, you can just define the property without a name. Or you can define it and overwrite. Or alternatively, you can put it on the top level of an error and define a new property given a specific value. And then we have inherit. Inherit is very similar to transparent in this error. So basically, it just lets you inherit all the properties from the defined error. And I would say there's some macro good practices, I would say, when implementing macros, and that is syn is your friend, use it, don't do weird shenanigans, and please propagate errors from your macros correctly. We have the up-to macro I mentioned earlier that is it's defined, and it's about 6,000 lines of code just generating stuff. And whoever wrote it wasn't me, decided to not use actual errors from syn and the other macro crates, but instead define their own error. And now every time that you get an error from the macro, you have no idea what's happening because it just errors out on the top level. And now you get just an error in a random place and you don't know what the actual cause is. So please don't do that. It makes your IDE halfway useless at that point. So yeah, so we had to change the infrastructure internally for being able to define errors from Rust to JavaScript. So we made this utility function to v8 error. Basically just accepts a v8 handle scope that's like basically just a global to interact with v8 and then the error itself. And basically it just does a bunch of stuff. It defines the JavaScript object with a bunch of stuff, like the class name, the message, the additional properties, and yeah, basically just does a few checks and returns that as a v8 exception. And then in the JavaScript side, we detect, oh, this is an error that we defined, given that we have a specific symbol. And yeah, then it checks and constructs an actual JavaScript error with all these properties that it has. Now, one macro is not enough. We have a second friend in town. We have boxed error that we also defined because one macro is not enough. We need a second one, which does, basically it's a utility macro for general usage, not just for the Deno case, but also any day error handling. That is basically just a helper for boxing things, because we had all these errors defined. I checked earlier about just in the Deno repo, not all the sub repos and crates, 210 errors that I had to rewrite to use this error and the Deno error macro. The problem then is, though, you have all these massive errors because we have like stuff with like 30 variants, and then these whole like massive structs like URLs, like whole blown URLs, and that just gets out of the hand. So we needed to box stuff. But boxing manually was getting a pain. So this was basically what we would be doing beforehand, which is just having, I mean, it's not quite like that, but that is the conceptual idea how it was. And that was getting annoying to implement that for every error, or if we wanted to do some other things, it was problematic. So we decided to just, why not make it shorter? I mean, just slap on a derive and it will do it for you. So you still have to define the kind as a separate enum, and then the actual struct that should not be saying enum, that should be saying struct Deno resolve error, actually wraps it, and then that's where the box is defined on, and it will basically automatically implement what we saw before, expecting that the name ends with kind, similar to IO and IO error kind. Now, what is the outcome of this? Well, much easier tracking of where errors actually originate from, especially panics, because with anyhow, through an entire big codebase like that, we were having some issues with figuring out where things is. That's the least to say. And then we had also now errors actually defined somewhere, because the one thing we were doing is we were defining also using the anyhow like macro to define inline errors using strings. So we actually had no clue where the error was coming from, because sometimes we're using that multiple times with the same values. It was a clusterfuck. So we decided, okay, yeah, this actually helps us with knowing actually where things are defined now. Because now also more predictable outcome of what functions are returning. Like now we know, oh, this function actually returns something proper, and like I know what I need to match on. It's not like, oh, this function is returning anyhow error. What is it actually the errors on though? Like I don't know what any of this is. Now I need to add handling for nearly every possible scenario. And that just makes mental overhead much more complicated and just hard to deal with. And it doesn't need to be that way. And then there was an increase of the binary size, but I would say it was worth it to actually be able to maintain code properly. And then there was also unsure if there was a performance change. Technically, maybe because of reduced the dynamic downcasting that we were doing all over the place, might be faster. I don't know. No one checked. No one cared. 6 months of work was done. Like whatever. Just land it, please. Now we had to block main for like a week or something like that for being able to land this massive work, because people were adding new errors all over the place using anyhow, and was like, please stop. I just want to land this. Now I need to rebase this again and spend another 2 hours figuring out what the hell you did. So we decided, okay, lock it down. Let's land this. And people started complaining to me. People from the company were complaining to me, you should have landed this in more smaller bits. It were already split up in like 25 different PRs across the single Deno repo, ignoring all the other repos, and was like, sure, if you want, I'm going to spend another half a year. So no. But yeah, and then we have a quote from Matthias Reisinger, Jesus, from Dynatrace, and he said, from Rust to JavaScript, communicating errors across language boundaries sounds like black magic. And it probably is, but Deno's JS error elegantly bridges the gap and makes it look easy along the way. Or alternatively said, pretty neat refactoring, eh? So, and then some tips and some information about rewriting errors from anyhow to thiserror, which is probably what most people actually came here for. In my opinion, again, anyhow being for apps and thiserror being for libraries, yes, but given this scenario, I really am now scarred for life using anyhow, so I'll be using thiserror for everything. Though I'll probably end up falling back to it because I'm too lazy to define errors for everything, and I feel like most people are. That's why anyhow is a thing. Then I would say on thiserror, don't just apply transparent to everything. It sounds cool and it does a lot of nice stuff for you, but it can get out of hand, and then everything is transparent and you don't know where anything actually is coming from, really. I mean, it does still show up the stack trace correctly, but it will, it's just some mental overhead I just recommend about not overly using transparent. And then you might start creating errors for everything and defining way too many errors. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we were at 210 errors for the main Deno repo. Yeah, we had more. We started deleting some of them because we were defining errors for basically everything, and that was just too much. We were duplicating some stuff, and we were just nesting errors way too deeply. But always when you nest errors, box them for sure, especially if they're large errors, because else it's just gonna blow up later on and you're not gonna be having a fun time. So make sure that you box up your errors ahead of time. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh my God, it popped up again. Anyhow, thank you very much. You can find the links there for the Deno project and Deno error and anything else that you might be interested in.